We're really delighted to have with us this evening veteran journalist Frank Sesno, who's here to talk about his new book, Ask More. Frank's basic premise is that knowing how to ask the right question is key to getting what you want in life, whether it's a job, a relationship, a house, or something else. He examines different kinds of questions, diagnostic ones, strategic ones, empathetic ones, confrontational ones, and so on, drawing from his own experience and the experience of others. He also emphasizes the benefits of what he calls, quote, deep, nuanced listening. Frank, of course, is himself a very skilled questioner. After starting out in local radio, he moved to the Associated Press as a radio correspondent, then landed at CNN in 1984. He spent two decades with CNN, serving variously as White House correspondent, Washington bureau chief, and anchor. As Wolf Blitzer recalls in the prologue to Frank's book, Frank as a correspondent was, quote, smooth yet forceful, respectful, but skeptical. He knew how to ask a probing question without grandstanding or giving a speech himself. Today, Frank teaches at GW, where he's director of the School of Media and Public Affairs. Reading Frank's book triggered recollections in my own mind of a course I took in business school before I started a career in journalism. It was a course in interviewing that turned out to be especially useful for me as a journalist. But as Frank makes clear, you don't have to become a journalist to appreciate the power and advantages of knowing how to phrase a question and also knowing how to listen for the answer. Smart questions, Frank says at the start of his book, makes smarter people. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Frank Sesno.
I might make reference to. Well, first of all, can I just thank all of you for being here? You have so much going on in your lives and traffic is so bad that to come in like this and to see some old friends and some new ones, I hope, is just a great honor. So thank you very much. Why did I write this book? You know, I thought, well, I could write a history of the presidency. I'd covered a couple of White Houses, although today that would be perilous work. I thought, well, I could do a book on Ronald Reagan. In fact, I thought of doing that because I covered that White House, and that was a very fascinating place. But somebody said, well, you should do a memoir. And I thought, well, who the heck would want to read about me? You know, I'm not very interesting. But what I started to realize as I thought about this is that what I observed suggested to me that people were leaving so much on the table by not asking well, that as a culture, we are increasingly challenged to sit still and listen well, because everybody's dashing through life and we are bombarded with information, with emails and texts, and that so many of my experiences had shown me that people just don't ask. I recall recently spending some time with some very, very good friends. We hadn't seen them in ages, and I realized, you know, we were spending a couple days with them. And they never really asked, well, how are you doing? And then going beyond that to really find out. I remember when my kids were little, and one of them is here, so I'm not talking about her. I would say to the boys at the table or something, so what's so-and-so doing for the summer? Just, you know, as school was out. They'd say, I don't know. And I'd say, well, didn't you ask? They'd say, well, no. And I'd say, well, they're your best friend. Why didn't you ask? Well, I don't know. I had an experience with a senior executive one time who came to the place I was working at that particular time in my life. And he was new, and he was a commanding presence. And he joined us and spent a day and some meeting all sorts of people. And I realized at the end of that visit that something was a little odd, something was a little different, and struck me, and that he had not asked one person one question about this new environment in which he found himself. Then I had an opportunity at a few years back to hang around with Jack Welch, then the CEO of GE, famous, and perhaps you've read his book. And Jack Welch is a question machine. He'll meet somebody, especially a young person, he's very engaged with them, and he'll ask them where they're from, where they're going, how they consume what particular information or music or anything, and just peppers them with questions, and it's a way for him to stay engaged with younger people. But the book was really born, and you'll see this when you read it, in a class that I taught a few years ago to a wonderful group of young people, and the class was The Art of the Interview. And as you said, there are some of these classes available, but not very many. And when I looked for books to use for the students, to use as guides, there was virtually nothing there. There's a book that was written back in 1997 and updated, but not much. And then there's a really terrific book from Australia. And in Australia, journalists start out as cadets. So these kids were having a hard time putting their brain around what a cadet meant. But when I taught this class, my final assignment to them, the final project, was an oral history. They had to interview an expert for one interview. They had to interview on the fly for something else, different applications of these sorts of things. And I encouraged them for their oral history. I said, go interview your grandma. Go interview your grandpa. Go do an oral history with your mother or your dad. And they had to record them on camera. And every single student who took that challenge up, some did oral histories with others, but every single one who took up the challenge to go interview a parent or a grandparent learned something not merely interesting, but profound and in some cases shockingly surprising. Why? Because they made an appointment and they sat there for 20 or 30 minutes with somebody they'd spent their whole lives with and just asked. And it led to one of the little, in the back of the book I have some ideas and suggestions, and try this as in summaries. And one of them is to sit with somebody you know very well and ask them questions about themselves for 20 or 30 minutes. And there are 2 words you're not allowed to utter during that time. Any guesses? I or me. I or me. How many times you have, there's this thing I call the I syndrome, right? And you'll say to somebody, oh my gosh, I was going to work today and I was in the car and I got rear-ended. It was the most horrific thing. And they'll say, you know, that happened to me just like, instead of saying like, yeah, are you okay? You know, that's it happened to me. How do you force yourself and others to turn attention away from themselves and focus on someone and say, I just want to ask you about you. Tell me about your life. We don't do that very much. I've had the great pleasure of interviewing so many amazing people, presidents and prime ministers and scoundrels and Nobel, and they're not necessarily the same, and Nobel scientists and winners and athletes and business leaders, CEOs and all the rest. And what I started to realize, and that's really where this came from, was that I asked differently depending on the type of person I was talking to and the outcome I wanted from that conversation. I listened differently, and I framed the questions differently. So that's where this idea was born. And I decided that the best way to go at it was to tell about these different types of questions and conversation through amazing people like Denise, who do this all the time. So I met this phenomenal family therapist. And I'd never been in therapy before, but by the time we got out of the airport, I said, I got to come back and do this again. This is making me feel really good, because she's such an incredible questioner. And this is in the chapter on empathetic questioning. Let me lay out for a minute, and I'll come back to that, these different types of questions and what I mean by this. I think the first floor of any question is, what's going on here? What's happening? What's wrong? That's what I call diagnostic questions. 3 people I talk to for that are a nurse practitioner in Appalachia. And the people she works with, she refers to as too often human train wrecks. They're in poor health. They're lower income people. They may not have access to health care through insurance or distance or logistics or whatever. And often they are hiding something because they're proud, but she has to work at it. As do most good doctors or nurse practitioners or others. When you go in, A good doctor, someone you really appreciate, will sit with you and make eye contact and spend time and not be doodling notes and ask you how you are and ask you again and ask you where the pain is and how often it happens and why. Well, she shares a chapter with my wonderful neighbor, Al. Al's a roofer. Al fixes your roof. When you have a leak in your roof, the water may be coming here, but the leak may be all the way to the other end of the building, or it may be coming in through the window. When Al comes, he does the same thing the nurse practitioner does. When does it leak? What do you notice about it when it leaks? Does it leak only when it's raining or when the wind is blowing? And he connects or tries to connect symptoms to history to the problem. And what they have in common, the other person in that chapter, is a Wall Street turnaround artist. And he goes in to rescue really dying companies. Does the same thing. Great questions to good people to figure out what the problem is. I hope there's a little lesson in each of these paragraphs, but the lesson in this one, I hope, is these people go looking for bad news. You want to figure out a problem, your mind has to be open, you have to have an appreciation for history and what's gone on in the past, and you have to go looking for the bad news. That's the only way you're going to actually be honest with yourself and figure out the problem. That may have some relevance, I think, to our political and cultural situation right now, because we often don't want to go looking for bad news. I feel fundamentally that the gift of the question is layered. If I ask you about you, where you're from, about your life, about why you're in the front row, about how much time you spend at Politics and Prose, about what kind of books you read, and about how many dozens of my book that you bought, I am connecting with you. I am saying to you directly and indirectly, I care. I care about you and your life and where you're from. That's why a good doctor is a great questioner. That's why great questioners are, in fact, great listeners. But through these questions, we also connect on many other levels as well. So diagnostic to figure out what's wrong, strategic to look over the horizon. But my character for that, and it was a tremendous day, was Colin Powell. Because I thought, I've known Colin Powell since I started as a reporter with Ronald Reagan in the White House, and he was in Reagan's White House. We were both a lot younger then. I like to say I was the kindergarten correspondent at the time, but close. But Colin Powell is also a very interesting case study, because in 3 different notable occasions, he posed a series of what I call strategic questions to himself and others. At the beginning of the first Gulf, prior to the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, prior to the second Gulf War, when we invaded Iraq, and back, if you recall, for a brief shining moment, when he was considering running for President of the United States. It's so interesting. He had 8 questions that he walked into the Oval Office to George H.W. Bush with, and he said, Mr. President, if we can say yes to all of these questions, then we've done our work, and I, as a military man, commend military action. And these 8 yeses, 8 questions that he said all had to get to yes, were the following. Is a vital national security interest threatened? Is the action supported by the American people? Do we have genuine broad international support? Have the risks and costs been fully and frankly analyzed? Have all other nonviolent policy means been fully exhausted? Have the consequences of our action been fully considered? Do we have a clear, attainable objective? And is there a plausible exit strategy to avoid endless entanglement? He asked those questions of the President of the United States and said, Mr. President, only if we can say yes to all of these should we do this. And I had covered this first Gulf War, and I traveled the world with George H.W. Bush, if you recall, as he put a true global coalition together. And they answered yes to all these, and we went to war, and the ground operation in Kuwait lasted 100 hours. In the second Gulf War, these questions were not posed in this way, and we are still there. And he noted to me, he was very candid, because I pointed out, like I didn't need to, but I pointed out that he had gone to the United Nations, right, with that famous speech saying weapons of mass destruction. He says, I know. I'm left holding the bag on that one, and that'll be on my grave. He posed a similar set of very personal questions to himself in 1996 when he was contemplating running for president for a brief moment. And there he took these strategic questions, these over-the-horizon questions, and he made them personal. And they included, is my family in on this? Essentially, do I have the fire in my belly to do this? And he couldn't answer yes to all of them. His wife, Alma, who has suffered from depression, and this has been noted in public writings that he and others have done, just wouldn't have been up for it, and he decided that he wasn't up for it, and he didn't run. Well, the idea of framing and posing those sort of over-the-horizon questions to ourselves, to challenge our own biases and to challenge the conventional wisdom around us, I thought was fascinating. Powell has this thing he was talking about when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He would have these commander meetings, and he would encourage his folks to come in and pepper him and one another with questions to really think through what they were doing. And it was precisely to avoid the groupthink that I think afflicted those at the highest levels of this government as we went into Gulf War II. How do we use questions to challenge ourselves? And I think one of the big, and we can talk about this when we open it up to Q&A, but I think one of the big crises that we've got now in this country is that we're not comfortable challenging ourselves and one another. Journalism, which is under siege as an enemy of the United States of America, which is a gross and terrible misstatement, is supposed to make us challenge our assumptions, is supposed to take us places where we don't normally go, is supposed to introduce us to the unfamiliar and ask us uncomfortable questions. A bunch of my journalism friends here who do this for a living. I'll talk about a couple of other types of questions that I found and conversations that I found really interesting here that I think relate. Many of you have probably heard of Dr. Tony Fauci, Anthony Fauci, and he's up at NIH, and he is a phenomenal human being who at 75, I think he is now, still works 6 days a week. And he was on the front lines of the HIV/AIDS crisis. He was working in infectious disease when the White House was still decrying this as a gay plague and not wanting to talk about it. But he was also under assault by many in the gay community for not moving quickly enough and not doing what he and science could do to save more people's lives more quickly. So I went up to NIH and I spent a day with Tony because a chapter in here is about science questions. There is such a great lesson to learn from science. Do we have any scientists in the room? A few, okay, great. Yay. What does science do? Science takes the physical world and tries to figure it out. And it's what I call the slow question, because many questions that science tackles take years or decades. It has patience. And it starts with a question and poses a hypothesis and then tries to prove it wrong. What a concept, to try to prove ourselves wrong and to submit and to testing and measurement and data over a long period of time and then submit that to your peers to poke holes in it. And to embrace uncertainty because we're going into the unknown. And Fauci was amazing as he told me what he was up against in the early days of that HIV/AIDS crisis, before they even had a name for the disease, and trying to figure out what was going wrong and causing it and how they could address it. But, and this is maybe a little lesson for listening, but I was spending these hours with Tony. Went up there very early. I think we started at 7 o'clock in the morning or something. He was already there. And it was all very interesting, but it was kind of, no offense, but sort of clinical. And I said to him, Tony, when you were doing this in the early days, what did that feel like? Because he had just told me a story about how he was on the rounds one day and this young man had just died and his family didn't know and he was alone in the world. I mean, it was a very, very scary time in those early days. And he paused and he took a breath and then he completely broke down. And then he erupted to talk about what motivated him, the outrage that he saw, the injustice that he saw, quoting him, the shit world that we lived in at the time, that would turn people out of their homes or deny them health care. And it was probably in my entire career the most personal, searing moment I'd ever had in talking to somebody in this capacity, because he just opened up. And that's the advantage of making that appointment to ask and listening and engaging someone on multiple levels. I will never forget that. And I put the entire dialogue in the book from that moment. Because I sat there and I thought, I almost wish I had a camera, but then I was glad I didn't, because I don't think we would have had that same moment. Maybe we would, but cameras do change things. But there was something phenomenal about it. The empathetic questions are very important, as I mentioned. Terry Gross is one of my characters. Anybody here Fresh Air? All right, yeah, this would be a Fresh Air audience, right? So Terry, I went up to WHYY in Philadelphia, where she's been. She's a tiny little person, and she's this little spring of a woman. And we sat in the studio, which was great for me because as an old radio guy, I love hanging out in studios. And she talked about her favorite interviews are with artists and authors and really creative people. And what she tries to do through her questioning is get to the essence of them, what she calls the essence of them and their creativity. Where does it come from? How does it happen? Can they open up? And some of it, much of it comes from her listening, but she studies, she reads about people she's interviewing, she listens to their speeches if they've talked, she knows them, some of them because she's interviewed them multiple times. And she told me of her most moving interview and her most emotional interview, which was with the author Maurice Sendak. Where the Wild Things Are. We all know Where the Wild Things Are. And it was toward the end of Sendak's life. And he was old, and a very good friend had just died. His partner was no longer living. And he started talking about his own sense of mortality and looking out the windows at these old maple trees. And she just listened, and she said yes and prodded him on. And he just spoke in nearly poetic ways. Did you hear the interview? You're nodding, right? And it really is a brilliant thing. And it's the kind of opening up that we would all wish to do with our best friends or our children or someone else. But there's so much to learn from that. So maybe I'll talk about one other of the genre of questioning that I think is so much fun. And that is what I call creative questioning. This is to get you like completely into another universe. This is to think big. And it can happen in the political world. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. To pose it or put it in a question. Or it can happen in a creative environment. So one of the guys I interviewed was this really cool, weird guy named Ed Bernero. And Ed Bernero grew up in a really rough really rough family and rough background in Chicago. And became a cop, became a Chicago cop. And he saw some of the worst of the worst. And he realized at some point, and I detail this in the book, that he had to get out. It was time to get out. But he couldn't do it right away, so he started writing. Just like some of the stories that had come from his life. And he started writing and doing screenwriting. And one day, his wife, who had a friend who taught at Northwestern, said that an executive from NBC was coming to speak at school. And so he had these TV shows that he'd written in his kind of imagination that it could be a TV show. And he said, gave it one to his wife, to give to her friend, to give to the NBC executive, which is what happened. And the exec reads it and goes, wow, this is pretty good. And within a few days, the guy calls him, and then he's got calls from more agents. Well, bottom line, Ed ends up out in Hollywood having an amazing career. And working with Bochco and John Wells and some really fine TV producers and directors. So I was told to go talk to him because he's a very creative guy, and he's a question machine. And he talked about how when he's challenging his writers, he challenges them not with commands but with questions. He says, because if I tell them what to do, in Hollywood everybody's kissing everybody else's butt. They'll just do what I tell them to do, and they'll all just go right off the cliff. But if I ask a question, he says, I engage them. And he gave me an example, not with a writer, but with one of his actors. So they were shooting a scene. This is so simple, but it's just, I don't know, there's something kind of artistic about it. They're shooting a scene, and he's got a cop, a guy who's playing a cop, and it's bright outside, the sun is shining, and the cop's got sunglasses on. And there's a woman right there, I'm pointing to this poor woman who keeps coming to Politics and Prose, says, I'm never coming back again the way this is. And he's got a woman who's like the suspect. And he's questioning her. And at a particular moment, he's supposed to take off his sunglasses and gaze at her. And they can't get the scene right because they can't get the timing down on this. And it doesn't work, and it doesn't work. And finally Ed says, cut, everybody take 5. And he goes over to the actor, and he says, look, when you take your sunglasses off, that's the first moment that you'll make eye contact with this person. And the camera will catch that. That's that moment of human dynamic. When do you think you should take your sunglasses off? He didn't say after the third line and the word toward, remove your sunglasses. He asked him when he thought he should take them off. And the guy says, well, let me think about that for a minute. And he did. And they went back and they shot the scene. Well, what Ed said, which was the killer for me, which is why I love the story, he said, actors consider themselves artists. Actors do not think of themselves as puppets on a string. Well, who wants to think of themselves as a puppet on a string? So if you're in a workplace, isn't it better if you ask your employees what they think we should do at a particular point? Or if you have an idea and you can turn it around as a question and pose it to them and let them convey to them, and you have to mean it. It can't be BS because people will look right through that. But that you actually trust them and want them to be part of the solution and the conversation. I would love to talk to you more about other chapters and parts of the book, but I'll go off onto another topic for a couple of seconds, and then we can go to Q&A. I think we have a national crisis right now in this space. I did not write this for journalists. I did not write it about journalists. I did not write it about politics, although there are political examples in here. But we have careened to a place where we don't listen to one another anymore. We have careened to a place where assertion too often, in my view, eclipses genuine curiosity and engagement. We need to encourage people to not fear a question that they can't answer right away, but view it as a challenge like we do in science. The media, I mean, I love the media, I guess, but I'm very worried about brandishing the media as the enemy of the American people. There is no way that the media, not is, but are, because what is commonly mistaken, the most fundamental mistake people make, is the media is some big singular object, and we can just paint it all with one brush. I have several friends here who were at CNN with me at one time or another. We never had a conference call at 7:30 in the morning with every other media corporation in the country to determine what that day's story was going to be. Just didn't happen. Not only were we not the enemy of the people, we thought that everything we did in one form or another, every question we asked when responsible, and most everybody was to inform people, was to hold the powerful to account through accountability questions, confrontational questions sometimes. I try to take it out of a political realm to make this point. If the grocery store down the street is selling tainted beef, do you want to know, or do you want to eat the beef and get sick? And if the butcher who works in the meat department whispers to a friend or a pal who he knows is a local reporter so that the word can get out because he's being told to put that beef out there so he can sell it another day. And by the way, this has happened. Do you want to know? Do you consider the butcher kind of a hero because even though he was told not to tell people, he put his job on the line to tell people so they wouldn't eat bad beef? And the answer is yes. And it's one of the reasons why not media, but our government passed whistleblower protections so that people who were inside who saw wrongdoing could bring it, leak it to the media so that we, the media, could inform people. I think media companies, news organizations in this country, need to go on a vast, concerted, two-pronged approach without sounding defensive or self-aggrandizing, which is very difficult to do. One, to be more transparent about how they make decisions and cover things so people understand it. And don't just say, oh, well, it's, a leak or this or that or you're an enemy. But there's actually a process here. There's a thoughtful, dynamic debate that takes place. There are a lot of questions that are asked before a leak goes on the air. When I was bureau chief, any of you remember Get Smart? Yeah, Max Smart. So we had remember Maxwell Smart's cone of silence? Okay. So I had what I called, when I was bureau chief, the cone of silence. And if a reporter came to me, I don't know, Henry, if you knew this, but if a reporter came to me with a sourced piece of information and wanted to go on the air with it, we respected the reporter's anonymous sources. But if it was very sensitive, and I felt I needed to know, we would step in the cone of silence, which was just my office, and I would say, okay, who's your source? You got to tell me. And we had a whole bunch of things that we did to try to make sure that the information we had was vetted, that the sources were solid, that we backstopped one another, that we had our own version of peer review where we tried or asked, could we be wrong about this? And we made mistakes, but it's not fake news to make a mistake as long as you correct it and hold people accountable for it. And that's the other thing that worries me, is this notion of fake news, this term of fake news that's thrown around. Fake news is not news you don't like. Fake news is not even news that's sensational or unfair. That may be bad journalism, but it's not fake news. Fake news is malicious, deliberately wrong, planted information with a bad intent. And I am very worried, and I'm glad to have this platform in this book that makes the point that we need to be courageous in the questions that we ask. We need to embrace questions that make us uncomfortable and that hold other people to account, and we need to listen very, very carefully to what people have to say and what it means. And we have to stop. We have to stop this sort of accusation culture of and any suggestion that the media are enemies. Some may be, okay? Again, the media is big and plural, but the overwhelming and mainstream media that is constantly under attack is not. As flawed as it is, as troubled as it is, as unfair and unbalanced as it sometimes is, it's certainly not an enemy of the American people. I asked everybody in my book what their favorite question was, just because. And Colin Powell's favorite question was, how you doing? I said, really? Why is that? He said, I'm a general. I have people's lives in my hands. I need to know how they're doing. I thought it was a lovely response. So even after asking everybody about what their favorite question was, I wasn't quite prepared for when somebody asked me, so Frank, what's your favorite question? But I've thought about it now, and in the backdrop of this conversation, my favorite question now is, how do you know? How do you know? How do you know what you think is really right? How do you know the information or the sources you get or where they are? How do you know you feel the way you feel? Can you be more aware of any or all of these things? Questions are sort of like air. They're all around us, and we don't think about them much at all. We take them for granted until something goes wrong. And so what I hope this book can do is make people think a little bit more deliberately about it, engage a little bit more consciously with one another and themselves, be more ambitious in the questions they ask, be more caring and empathetic in the outcomes they've got, and connect outcome to question to listening. So with that, I would thank you all very much, and I'd be delighted to take some questions.
I don't remember a section in your book on book talk questions. Do you have any advice before we get to the questions?
Short, sweet, and simple.
Good advice.
Recently, we've seen some press conferences where you can ask a question, but you will not get anything close to a coherent response. How do you deal with somebody who basically goes to a totally different world? How do you actually get your answers questions answered.
Well, Washington's a really good place for that, right? You know, people are trained here to ignore the question and answer what they want to do, and you know, I'm doing that a lot now. So in response to your question, the car I want to buy next year, it's why the art of listening is so important, and it's why follow-ups are so important. In journalism, we call it follow-ups. And throughout this notion of asking more, it's not just, you know, being more curious, but it's literally being deliberate and disciplined in stringing a series of questions together. Don't ask a compound question. You all know what a compound question is, right? It's 4 questions in one. Because what do? You give the person the opportunity to pick one part of the 4. They answer that, they ignore the other 3. Go one at a time and be precise. If somebody doesn't ask, come back at them and ask again. The toughest interview I did with this was with George Herbert Walker Bush. It was the last interview of before he was defeated in 1992. I flew out to La Crosse, Wisconsin. His poll numbers were down. Looked like Bill Clinton was doing very well, thank you. And Lawrence Walsh, the independent counsel, had been looking into Iran-Contra, had just indicted Caspar Weinberger, who had been the defense secretary in the Reagan administration. And George Herbert Walker Bush had maintained a studied distance from Iran-Contra throughout the entire crisis, for those of you who remember that little walk in the park from a few years ago. And so I had this interview with the president. We also had new poll numbers that showed his numbers down. And there had been a little blip going into the weekend. This was Sunday. So I said, well, Mr. President, welcome. The cameras are rolling. We're live. You know, it's all a very nice thing. And I really, really liked and respected George Herbert Walker Bush. He will never get the credit that he deserves as a really solid, good president. He did a lot of things. But my job was to interview him. So I said, you know, basically I started asking about this Caspar Weinberger business. He didn't want to comment on it. And I asked again, and he wouldn't comment on it. And he finally said, Frank, are you going to ask anybody about anything else? And I said, well, Mr. President, you're running for president. It's a couple days before the election. This has happened. I think the American people have a right to know what you have to say about this, because you were vice president at the time all this stuff happened. And he didn't answer it. The answer to your question is sometimes you don't get an answer, but you have to be persistent. You ask several times, and in a public context, and this is what I talk about in confrontational questioning, often it's for the record. So if you ask a question of President Trump and he ducks or he dissembles or he is direct, whatever it is, people can see it, and people will make their own judgment. There's a point beyond which you can't go. But by asking deliberately several times from different angles and being thoughtful about that, anticipating that they're going to dodge, you try to come in on it. In press conference, it's really tough because you got 1,000 people and you get 1 or 2 questions, you're not going to get much if somebody really wants to avoid it. Yes, sir.
Given the current climate, do you think any imposition of prior restraint is a possibility?
In what context? What do you mean?
Prior restraint on the news media by the administration?
Do I think that's possible that they would do that or try it?
Or what is the
desirable?
probability? Yes.
I don't know how they would do that. I mean, they're trying to make it very uncomfortable to be in the media now and to be a journalist. They're trying to bring in some of the things they're doing I think are great. I mean, I actually like the Skype seats, or the idea behind the Skype seats that they've got, as long as it's not just a parade of, you know, ideologically driven journalists asking softball questions. That becomes a waste of time. But the idea of bringing in questioners from across the country to the White House briefing room, I think is really cool. I like that a lot. They'll go after leakers big time. But so did Obama. They will, you know, I think the most damaging thing probably right now is just this campaign, this persistent public campaign. Although there was a Quinnipiac poll out today, I don't know how many of you saw it, and the president is not, I mean, more people believe the media than believe the president right now. Now, I'm not sure he cares, and there's still, you know, he still has a I believe there's a third of this country that really does believe that the media are fundamentally dishonest and biased. And the media need to address that. I think just doing your job as normal, which is a lot of what I hear, we're just going to do our job. You know, this doesn't change a thing. I don't think that's sufficient. I think if an airline were flying with this level of public trust, they'd be flying empty airplanes and staring bankruptcy in the face, and they would do something about it. So I think that there's something that needs to be done. Some of it is public education, some of it is being more forthcoming. Prior restraint, suspending habeas corpus, whatever. we're in a different place if we start going down that road, and I don't think and I hope that won't happen.
What do you perceive as the media's response? What do you perceive as the media's responsibility in bridging this seeming unbridgeable gap between the left and the right in the United States? Is the answer the media being offended at being called the opposition party and launching a complete and total counterattack? Or is there some place where they should seek for a mediation that would enable the gap to lessen, or should we let it go to a revolution?
Let it go to a revolution.
I'm serious.
Listen, you can come up with some very dire scenarios without a whole lot of imagination these days. No, I don't think the media should launch an assault back. I think that could be counterproductive. I think it can sound defensive. And I don't think there's almost a conflict of interest built in there if the media are trying to make that point, and people will say, well, there they go again. But they can explain how they work better. They can engage a deeper conversation with the public. They can participate in forums where these conversations take place. I have thought of a number of ideas. What if journalism schools across the country, and I've actually talked to some colleagues about this, what if we had, for lack of a better term, a teach-in on a given day? And you could have a series of schools in all different parts of the country doing different things, and we turned those elements of that conversation into a course that could then be taught to high school and other, because we've got to think about the public education part of this. There will be others. John McCain was very vocal defending a free press. I can get out there now with the platform that I've got with this book at the university and explain, I'll tell the tainted beef story, right? We can do this through analogy and in other ways so that it's not always thoroughly political. But the problem that we've got, the challenge that we've got with social media, with very ideologically driven media, is and with a lot of talk radio and a lot of talk TV for that matter, is we've driven this kind of notion of conspiracy and whatever very, very deep in a lot of places. And there will be some we're not going to be able to talk out of that. But we need to try, and we need to teach media literacy. I'm looking at my friends from CNN and media. What's changed so much since we started is we don't control this world anymore. Used to be an executive producer or an executive editor made the decisions. We didn't put bomb scares on the air. We didn't, unless there was a reason, unless some big avenue was shut down. But now if we don't put it on the air, well, somebody else may, but somebody will put it up on their Twitter feed or on Instagram, and it's out there. The shift is to the public, is to news consumers, to be much more thoughtful and much more involved and much more informed about the information they consume, just like the cars they buy and the food they consume. And that's going to take an ongoing effort. Thank you for your question. Yes, sir.
This is, in a lot of ways, just a continuation of the same question, I guess, at least closely related. But mostly, I'm not entirely clear what you're saying about the media. I appreciate that you brought that up as the final element of the thing. About bias in the media. It certainly seems to me that the widening political divide is associated in some way with a clearer bias in the, I guess we can call it the mainstream media. It seems like it's easier to predict ahead of time what elements of the media are going to be, including what news in the, so it's certainly clear in editorial policy and opinion part of the media. I guess my question is mostly, are you saying that you don't think the news part of the media has become particularly biased in both directions? And it's kind of a compound question that you avoided me. But if so, is it the fault is it the media simply responding to the widening divide and feeding an audience that is bifurcated into two spheres, or does the media bear some responsibility for causing and perpetuating the divide? So
It's a great question, and it is a compound question. It's also a complex question, but it's also a very important question, and it's one that people are asking. Is what do we mean by media bias? How damaging is it? Is it cause and effect? Is it leading or is it following the country? There are so many explanations for this. Just a very fundamental one, when the internet and started, sort of really having a dominant role or a predominant role. And this is really back in the 90s and early 2000s. A lot of newspapers realized that by the time their front page landed on someone's doorstep, people had already read the story, so they had to have more interpretive reporting to give people more context. You start moving into more interpretive reporting, there are more adjectives, and people start confusing that with opinion. What Fox News clearly demonstrated is that there was a huge audience that felt it was unserved, and in fact, they were not wrong about that. And a lot of the framing of the stories from the usual suspects in the mainstream media were pretty predictable framings. Religion was poorly covered or not covered at all, which made people feel apart. Some of the more controversial elements of social policy where there was sort of a consensus around that in much of the media, and it made people feel apart. And what we saw in this election is a real problem, which is much of what we do in media comes from New York and Washington and the coast, and there's a whole bunch of country that lives a very different life in between. And we need to tell those stories too. So, what's that? Oh, no, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. No. So I think that there are many, many factors in this. Personally, I think the part of the media that has been most deleterious to our republic. Tell me the last time you saw a public official interviewed seriously or for a long period of time talking about his or her accomplishments, talking about the compromise that they reached, talking about a problem that had been solved. Now, I'm not into solutions journalism, let's all feel good, but the drumbeat narrative in a lot of talk radio and talk television is how incompetent everybody is, as what a scoundrel everybody is, everything is, and the Pew Center has studied this, the amount of horse race coverage versus the actual reporting, certainly in television and cable television in particular. And so no wonder people have a grim idea of what goes on. So I think it's a very, 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 very complicated question, and this fake news thing plays right into this. I was at a presentation last week, just to really give you a scary thought, and we're not very far away from a technology that will be that can, where you could, on your computer at home, take a speech from a public official, we'll just leave it at that, and take individual words and edit them together and have them say something very convincingly, literally be able to splice it together, sort of like Photoshop for video, and you would never know it's false. What happens when that starts going out there? So we're just entering this kind of brave new world, which is why I say that I believe there's got to be, we got to ask ourselves and others a lot more really tough questions about what we do, like you asked, and be brave and honest in the answers that we produce and what we hear. Thank you.
This is a very interesting story that you've been telling, and I grew up asking questions. It's how I learned. But I had this extraordinary experience at Apple Computer one day where I had a genius, probably 50 years old, an African American, and he was helping me do all this stuff. And I said, "How did you learn this?" And he said, "The first thing they teach you at Apple is if you don't know, ask. We all learn together." And then I saw a woman who had to have been at least 60 as a genius. And I thought that's exactly what we need to bring to the Defense Department. So, well, at Defense...
What, geniuses or questions?
Questions.
Both.
Maybe both. But at the Defense Department, the culture was you never wanted to ask a question because it exposed your ignorance, as opposed to exposing your curiosity. And this morning I heard the chairman at Brookings, and I asked him to do me a favor. And I said, Apple has this great saying, we ought to bring it to the Defense Department, and I want you to do that.
And he said,
Yes. We'll see how soon that happens. But I've been trying for 2 years to get to Ash Carter so I could get him to do it. Well, they have such a moat around these people at the top. It's very hard to get to them. But I think this business of feeling secure asking questions, and I'm sure it's true, that as kids get older and they ask questions, they're told not to do it.
well, what do we do with our little kids? We love our little kids. Sometimes they drive us crazy. Why, mommy? Why, daddy? How, daddy? When did it happen, daddy? And over and over. But we think, isn't that wonderful? They're going to be great learners. But we sort of talk people out of that, and then you find yourself in a staff meeting. You don't want to sound dumb, or you're someplace else, and if you say that, it's going to sound like you're out of step. But actually, if you craft the question thoughtfully and carefully, you can navigate that space and put some pretty thoughtful and provocative things down on the table, and I encourage that.
I would argue what you want to do is you want to reward curiosity. And
Yes. So I interviewed Gavin Newsom for the book, and Gavin Newsom's a really interesting guy. So Gavin Newsom is a very curious fellow, and he asks a million questions. You know one of the reasons why? Gavin Newsom has dyslexia.
Right.
Okay? He went to 8 different schools. He was constantly being told he couldn't do things. So he just asked and asked. And he says, I can't really sit there for a long time and read. It just doesn't work for me. It's hard for me to do these things. So he learns this way. But his family comes from a broken home. I don't know if you know this. His father was a judge and gave all their money away. His mother was, a housekeeper and a bunch of things and had a bunch of jobs. But they were very lucky because his father had gone to school with a guy named Getty. So they hung out with the Gettys. So Gavin Newsom hung out with the Gettys, and the Gettys took a liking to him and helped him as he launched and thought he was a very creative guy. And they helped him make some of his early investments. So one of his investments was this a hotel in Lake Tahoe. So we went into business on this hotel, and he told this hysterical story about how the hotel had no screens. And one particularly rainy year, they had all these mosquitoes. And people were getting bit, and they hated this. One night, he got a call from the night, it was 6 in the morning, saying, oh my God, something terrible has happened here. You've got to get here right away. He said, what's wrong? He said, there are dead fish carcasses all over the property. And he said, well, calm down, go figure out what this is. Well, what they found out, was that one of the people in the maintenance department or whatever thought the mosquitoes were so terrible that he stocked the ponds with fish. I don't know what kind of fish. I don't remember what kind of fish that eat mosquitoes. Only the raccoons found the fish and had a field day and dragged them out and had fish carcasses all over the place. So when they figured this out, the guy called him back and said, you got to fire this guy. And Newsom said, I'm not going to fire him. I'm going to give him a bonus. And he started a failure award to encourage risk-taking. He said that wasn't malicious. He was trying to do something. So, it's a funny story, and it's his favorite question, by the way. Newsom's favorite question is on his desk. It's a plaque. It's what would you do if you knew you could not fail? Okay? I will be fast. I'm sorry. I yapped too long.
I will be medium.
Okay.
Since you did ask, one of my favorite questions is, what did I just say?
What you just said is, one of my favorite questions is, what did I just say? How am I doing? Okay.
Well, you've addressed in several different ways what I am going to ask, but it is part of the First Amendment, and no one seems to know in a general way the difference between reporting journalism and opinion, and why, or is there, as an academic, why do we not teach these principles to the general school and college population and not just those people who want to go into the profession?
Hear, hear.
So what are you going to do about it? That's my next favorite question.
Well, after I sell 1 million books and I have so much money, No.
Well, you are in a position to make a difference.
I'm talking to colleagues and others about this very thing now. What can we do?
And high school.
Because we need to do something, and we need to do something big and bold, and it's going to require people with big ideas and, you know, frankly, some big pocketbooks to do this kind of stuff. Because, and I there are amazing tools now, but we can't force people to consume this stuff. By the way, the analogy, the very good analogy, I think, is food. All right, we know what is more or less what is healthful food to eat. We know what's bad for us. A third of America is obese. So, more actually. It may be 2/3. There's some huge number. It's some shocking number. Okay? So, and these are people who see their doctors. These are people who watch, you know, health shows, presumably, even if maybe they don't. I don't know. But so, we can't force people to eat their peas. So what journalists can do is be better storytellers. My friend Henry here is with 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes is an unbelievably great, proven platform. And people don't throw 60 Minutes under the ideology bus because it does stories from all different perspectives, and it takes time. And by the way, it grills people sometimes. No pun intended. But so I do think that because it's now about news consumers, the educators, journalists, civic-minded people, parents, are going to need to do a much better job at asking the right questions of themselves and their kids and others, and teaching media literacy.
I mean, it is. You teach business. People take business classes without going into business.
And they still don't save. No, I mean,
but they buy.
They buy. But the point is, we shouldn't pretend that this is going to be easy, because it's going to be really hard.
I think you have to start somewhere.
I agree. Thank you.
My question relates just to that point. I think it should start in the journalism schools, and I think I know the reason why it's not. But let me put it this way: I think that the journalism schools collectively should be judging the work that's being done in various media and publishing that. And if the faculty does not want to be in the forefront because of the criticism, give it to your students.
So you think that the fact that the journalism schools should put a sort of good housekeeping seal of approval on every piece of journalism?
No, not approval. Review afterwards. You can put it on your website.
Like what's good journalism, what's
not? Well, what your class, what your school felt were the better stories, and what might have been wrong with it.
So can I do a little commercial and give a plug and congratulate you on a great idea? This year,
because it's yours.
No, it's not. It's not.
Okay.
This year, a fantastic group of students at GW started a project, and you can all look it up, called Mediafile. And they are self-styled media critics. So one of our students just last week wrote a really wonderful piece on leaks, and Politico picked it up. So these are students doing this. It's inspiring, and it's great stuff, and it makes them, gives them a voice, it gives them a profile, and it's
let them create a website that is going to be copied and built upon by other journalism schools. Have them contribute constructive criticism about what is being published and what's right, what's wrong. That'll be a dialogue. And when that dialogue takes off, I think that's where you're going to get media literacy, and I think that's where you're going to get some improvement, because you can couch it in terms of the media wanting to improve itself, looking to the schools and the students.
I think it's a great idea, and I hope that these students have started this.
But you got to call your friends at Columbia Journalism School. You got to get them, all these out in Arizona, who went out there and got a big contract.
School. Okay, you've given me my homework assignment. Thank you very much. Are you there for a question, Mr. Reeb?
No, sir.
No. I know this man from way back, so if there was time for one more, we would do that. I think we're probably we're out of time, but I just want to leave you with one thing. One of the most wonderful bits that I picked up in working on the book was in this idea of listening, and the idea of knowing what kind of a listener you are. I'd never thought of it this way before. But there's this wonderful woman. She's a consultant, and she helps hospitals and universities and nonprofits raise money. And if any of you have ever tried to raise money, right? The way to raise money is not always to just ask someone for a check, but to get to someone to sign on to a mission they care passionately about and that they want to help change. And that requires great listening. So she said, know what kind of a listener you are. I said, well, what do you mean by that? She said, well, people are different, all sorts of different listeners. Are you an interrupter? Are you a gap filler? Are you easily distracted? Do you take out your smartphone while someone else is talking? Right? Are you drawn to data and fact? Or do you zero in on story, anecdote, and people, and personality? And it's so interesting. Colin Powell had what he called his commander's rule when he had these little sessions. And his commander's rule was the commander, the person who's convened the meeting, speaks 30% of the time. Others are speaking 70% of the time. But some very thoughtful awareness of what kind of listeners we are, coupled with a deliberate approach to the kinds of questioners we are, can, I think, address some of these things that we've talked about tonight. Ain't going to change the world overnight, and the media, we'll work on it, but like I said, it's a big plural word. So we've got our work cut out for us. But I want to thank you for great questions tonight. They've been very provocative and interesting. And I'm supposed to sit here and sign books now?
Yeah, and books are available at the checkout desk. And please form a line to the right of the table. And remember to fold up your chairs.
And I want to thank you all very much. Thank you.